Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Good. Hey, Nick. How are you doing, man?
Good. How are you?
I'm
Thanks
good.
for
I'm
having
good.
me.
And thanks for joining. Hello, everyone. I can see already some comments. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. I'm not sure where you are, but I suspect you can hear us. If I can maybe start traditionally by asking, where are you from? I know I can see by some names. I recognize already some names, so I can suspect what city and the country. But you can just put your like a thumb up. You can hear us, and like what city, country you are from. That would be nice, to see how much coverage we have. Yeah. Okay. So I'm very happy. This is like a 10th episode of our podcast, and today we have a very very special guest. Nick Dika, who works in Universal Audio, and this is very interesting episode. But usually we had product managers, product directors, sometimes funders, but obviously like a building audio products, it's not just like it's mostly not managers, right? It's some people call it like a product trio. You have engineers and obviously designers. So finally we have super experienced designer who work on audio products. I mean for his entire career. So that's I hope will.
Almost. Yeah.
Okay,
Mostly.
okay, right. So maybe with this, so maybe one. Oh, hey, Noam. Hey.
No.
I,
I see we have
one of
somebody from Montreal. I'm actually not too far from Montreal. I'm about 2 hours south in Vermont.
okay.
So I'm like about as far north as you can get without being in Canada, which might
I
which
got
might
it.
come in useful someday.
Yes, I saw these pictures, of a new maps, right? Okay, so I can see Greece. So cool, nice to see you, and I can see Tel Aviv. So we have I mean people from all around the world, literally. So cool. So traditionally, let me just start by before I give a floor to Nick and let him introduce himself. Oh, New Delhi, India, perfect.
India. Awesome.
Yeah, great. Um, yeah, so the agenda. So we made a small change. Right now we have 90 minutes because it was always an hour, and we always run out of the time, and it was, we just we're going, oh Florence, all right, that's great. Okay. Okay, so yeah, so this time we're actually making hour and a half. Uh, so initially we'll start by Nick setting the floor and giving some context about his career, and then I think we'll just go deeper into the subject of UX and in audio products, and there will be like a entire Q&A for 20, 15, 20 last minutes, but obviously feel free to ask questions throughout the session. We may not actually like answer all of them in the once we like discuss topics, but yeah, we can always display them. There are some. Oh, hey, nice to meet
Hey.
you. Okay, yeah. So with this set, Nick, maybe if you could just like introduce yourself and tell a little bit about your career path, and I'm actually curious how you got into UX and specifically audio UX. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I said I've almost always worked in audio. I I went to school for initially for music, um, but pretty quickly realized that I wasn't really that interested in pursuing like a sort of formal classical or jazz music education. I was way more interested in just recording music on a cassette 4-track in my dorm room. So I kind of joked that I ended up majoring in English and I minored in recording music on a 4-track in my dorm room. And so I kind of eventually got into computers and music and early audio interfaces. Like I had one of the first USB audio interfaces for recording onto my computer in the early 2000s.
Mm-hmm.
So I was kind of a hobbyist, and I kind of went out to work in a couple jobs. Like I worked for an e-commerce startup that failed, and I got laid off. And then I went to work for an ad agency writing ads for banks, and that was really boring. And I eventually kind of just like, went through this like, what am I doing with my life phase where I had a friend that was working at Guitar Center selling guitars. He's like, oh yeah, I make pretty good money and it's a fun job. And I was like, okay, I'll go work in retail for a while. And it was kind of, I think everybody kind of wondered what I was doing going back to retail, but it ended up being a really good career move in a sense, because I met a lot of people that were product reps that were coming into stores and teaching us about things and teaching customers about things. So I sort of eventually figured out that, hey, that would be a good way for me to get into an audio company. So I eventually got a job at Cakewalk, which some of you might remember Cakewalk. They had a DAW called Sonar, which was becoming popular at the time. And they, of course, had this MIDI editor from way back in the 80s. First MIDI sequencer for Windows. So yeah, I went to work at Cakewalk, and I was like a rep on the road teaching people how to use the software. So that was kind of my entry into the industry. And from there, I worked in sales and marketing for a while, but I was always really interested in the product side. And after I left Cakewalk, I went to another company called Isotope, which was also in Boston. And I started there as a marketing employee. I was actually the first marketing employee at Isotope. It was only about 10 people at that time. I think I was actually employee number 10. And so I did that for a while, but I always really was interested in the actual building products and sort of deciding what goes into products, and always had tons of opinions about it, and always would talk any product manager I met's ear off about, hey, they should really have this and this and this. And I think that was kind of informed by the fact that I was a product specialist. I was out on the road talking to customers all the time, or going to trade shows as a marketing manager and talking to customers. So the opportunity kind of arose at Isotope because they didn't have a full-time product manager. And Mark, my boss, was like, well, could you help us with some user research on RX? And because we hadn't yet released RX at that point, it was just a product that they'd been working on for years. And so kind of I did sort of my first, sort of user interviews around that. And eventually I went on to be a product manager working on products like Ozone and many other Isotope products. And that's, I know this is a long story so far, but this is how I got into UX, because I realized at some point that a lot of the work that I was doing as a product manager was actually user experience design. But I didn't even know what that was called yet, because this was in the mid 2000s, and UX really wasn't, Don Norman had kind of coined the term user experience design, but it wasn't like a profession yet in the way it has become. It was really kind of, people were still figuring out what that meant. So I kind of figured out as I was doing this job of product manager that a lot of what I was doing was figuring out how to arrange the product in a way that people would understand it, and kind of matching features to, different target users, and understanding, what are principles of good design and how to use those to make an effective product. So yeah, that's kind of how I got into UX. And I think, I worked at Isotope for like 7 or 8 years. I went out on my own for a while and made an iOS app. Then I went to SoundToy. So I went to another plugin company where I did design and sort of various other things. And then eventually ended up at UA. So I've been at UA for almost 5 years, which doesn't feel like that long, but yeah, UA's been very fun. Gotten to work on a lot of really cool products, a lot of plugins, but also, other stuff like we have guitar pedals and there's a mobile app that controls the guitar pedals, which I worked on. We have, Luna, which is a great DAW that UA makes that I've done some work on. So yeah, UA has been a great opportunity because UA does so much. So it's been really fun as a designer to work on a wide range of stuff.
Yeah. When I heard that, probably everybody who, makes music or like a mix, even not professionally, uses, that or another UA plugin. So when I heard that you were involved in Sound City, I was so, hyped, because it's such a cool plugin, and actually mostly because of the design. And obviously it's just such a nice story around it, right? It made me like watch the entire, documentary about Sound City Studio, etc. I say, wow, it's just knowing somebody who actually was like a behind the scene, like working on this plugin, was, I was saying that's something. Yeah. So you were right.
Thanks,
I understand you were involved, right, in Sound City.
Yeah, I worked on the UI and UX on Sound City, which I'm not sure if, let me see if I actually have it here. Sound City.
You'd like me to show?
Oh, I may need to like switch the screen that I'm sharing here. Present.
Yeah, we can
Sorry,
share
bear
this.
with me for a second.
Oh yeah.
Are you able to see this? Or you're just seeing live and not the plugin window?
Yeah, I can see the DAW.
Oh, but you can't see the plugin?
Yeah, no, just DAW.
That maybe is a live thing, huh? Anyway, I'm not able to show the plugin, I guess. But yeah, so Sound City was it was really cool because we have this. UA's done a few plugins like this in the past where there's a sort of studio that we're trying to recreate. So you can send sound into this sort of virtual recording studio and sort of capture, even if you've recorded in a small space or like in a really dead room, you can essentially kind of reamp the sound or send the sound out into this room with a collection of really cool microphones, and you can essentially add the sound of that room to your recordings. So that was kind of the spec. But with Sound City, we did something a little bit more immersive and kind of allowed people to actually drag mics around in a physical space. So even though it's a 2D plugin, we created this whole 3D environment, and you can choose different sources in the room and move the mics around the sources. And so it was a really ambitious project, but it was really fun to work on. There was I spent a lot of time doing 3D modeling and
let me just, maybe so people, let me just, so people see, actually, I'm just trying to, in the meantime, find in some, on the internet, like, so we can actually, share what you mean. Let me, I think I have it.
Let me see if I can, I'm going to try to open up Logic instead of Live and see if I can get
I want to make a, okay.
plugins open so we can see them. Yeah, it's weird. Cool. I wasn't able to see the plugins in Live when I shared my screen. I could see them on my screen, but I couldn't see them on.
Sure, but can I ask you like a question? So, like, did you, so how did you learn the graphic design, and did you take any formal, so you started marketing and product management. So when you sort of was slowly moving to a UX, did you take some a formal education or some courses? How did you sort of transition to these roles? Do you have, or did you know the graphic design in the beforehand? Or this 3D modeling, etc.
I think it was always really just kind of a side interest for me. Really, I was always, I think, like a lot of people, always loved playing around in Photoshop and just doing fun stuff, making flyers for my band if my band was playing, or things like that. But I never really considered myself a graphic designer. But as I sort of developed skill with product management and UX design, I ended up managing a lot of designers, or a few designers really, at Isotope as freelancers, and sort of saw what they were doing and sort of realized that, wow, this is really cool. And there was one of the founders of Isotope was this guy named Amadeo, who had designed the original interfaces for Ozone, the Ozone 1.0 he designed, and Vinyl, and all of the original Isotope plugins, Trash. And when I became a product manager, Ama was kind of, he would sometimes still work at Isotope as a contractor. But Mark, my boss, was like, hey, I needed to redo some feature or something. And he just gave me the PSD files for Ozone and these other plugins. And so I learned a lot just by having access to Amadeo's work and being able to look at how he used layers and how he created these amazing effects. And I think part of his process too was using 3D software to create these sort of retro futuristic GUIs that he made. But that was a huge inspiration for me, and I think that sort of was like a tutorial into using Photoshop in some ways. And then over the years, I just kind of gained more and more skill doing different things, and became really interested in 3D modeling, and started to learn how to use Blender and Cinema 4D to create realistic scenes and sort of more just sort of abstract stuff. But I always found 3D modeling. It reminds me a lot of when I first got into using computers for recording and making music, in that it's this sort of limitless, very technical, very detailed, you can get lost in all the different tools and plugins and details of using 3D software in a very similar way that you can with using a DAW. So I think that was kind of the appeal early on, and then I just got some skill at it and realized that a lot of audio companies, I think we're a little bit weird in that, many other companies and industries moved away from what people call skeuomorphic design, or sort of, physically realistic plug-in GUIs or software GUIs, like the early iPhones, when you first got the iPhone interfaces, like the Notes app looked like a notepad, and so that was something that a lot of industries abandoned, but audio has never really totally lost it. And I think there are some reasons for that, but it's also meant that there's been this demand for designers that can do 3D work. If you want to make a realistic space like Sound City, or if you want to make a realistic emulation of a compressor from the 60s, it's very hard to do that without, in something like Figma. You need to have the 3D applications to get photorealistic lighting and all that stuff, and it's a whole process and skill set that is probably a little bit unique to audio. Game designers have some of the same tools and use some of the same techniques, but the way it's put together is very different, and audio plugins are very limited in a certain sense. We don't have all the fancy tools and game engines that game developers have, so we have to do some kind of
until we go to VR
to make it work.
Until sometime we go to like a VR dose, right? And we'll just like have like a VR compressors, etc. Yeah,
that would be fun. I'd be into that personally.
Yeah. That's okay. So that's a super interesting point. Yeah, I mean, I hear you, and I mean, we have some questions that arrive, for this podcast, before we aired and before we met. So you remember that some of those actually was related, to how you can sort of balance this aesthetics, from the, let's say, old hardware, like a traditional hardware, and how to sort of like sort of have both of, best of both worlds, right? So like how to have this great aesthetics of like a old gear, and actually like a great user friendliness of a like a software. So I'm not sure if you can maybe say a word about that. So how does it work for you?
Well, I mean, I think there's sort of this balance between when you're doing these kinds of audio plugins or interfaces that are sort of historically inspired, I guess. If you're trying to recreate a specific piece of hardware from a specific era, like that's part of the experience. And you kind of, especially on the engineering side, there's so many talented DSP engineers at UA that are making incredibly detailed audio recreations of these classic tools. And then on the other end, it's like you kind of, as a designer, I feel like I want to be faithful to that in some way, because you could make a very simplified, modern, clean, flat interface to represent a 1176 compressor, or an LA2A, or a Fairchild, or something like that. But it doesn't really tell the story so much. It could be perfectly functional. It could be easier to use in some ways for certain people.
Okay.
But it's you lose a little bit of the history and the story, and so but then there's other, you have to kind of balance that though against, that may be attractive for a certain type of user that's maybe coming from a background where they really, I went to visit a studio recently where the engineer was just very obsessed with like the golden era of recording in 60s and 70s music, and he had built this whole studio with a lot of hardware, and so he knows what all the hardware is. He's knows more about the hardware than I do. Whereas if you've got somebody that's more coming from, they're like a computer native, generation, where they've grown up using Ableton Live, or using more minimal interfaces, maybe they're not so interested in this particular classic compressor from the 60s. So I think that sometimes you can have it both ways though, because we do, for example, at UA, we have plugins that are very specifically modeled on a specific piece of hardware. But then we have some of the newer stuff that we've been doing, like, for example, Top Line, which is like a vocal studio channel strip kind of thing, or Verve, which is like a sort of vintage, warmifying, vibe plugin. Those plugins are examples of like they do bring in a lot of the sort of audio hardware modeling that UA is known for, but we presented it in a very modern way that's not so literal. And so I think that you kind of have to. I think you really, at the end of the day, you have to be thinking about who you're designing for, and is the person going to appreciate the history of that compressor, or do they really just want to get the sound quickly? Do they want to get a warm vocal sound?
Fair point.
And you, as the designer or as the product manager, know the perfect combination of hardware effects to get that sound, and then you wrap it up in a package that they just have to turn one knob or a few knobs to get the result. So, yeah, sorry, I know that's kind of a long rambling answer.
No, that's a very good. Yeah. That's a very good one, actually. Yeah. That's exactly. It really depends on who you design for, right? Either this is like a nerd who actually appreciates all this, and actually knows this old gear, and he simply wants to have something which is similar, or actually you do some tools for a younger generation, or some as you say, computer natives, who actually want to have a quick, or some kind of like a balance between those. Cool. Nick, can I ask you just like this, sure. To me, like a super, basic, like a question I wanted to ask at the very beginning, we went straight, to Sun City and other plugins, but there are obviously, our initial conversation before the podcast was that there are certain specifics about, doing design for audio products, and, obviously it starts with people and roles, and I know that you were product manager before, so what is your in your opinion, like a typical setup in audio companies, you saw, or how in your opinion, this a design function differs from, as specifically, that obviously we have also a DSP engineers involved, etc., maybe something else, right? I just wanted to make a reference that usually people in, I say, this kind of Silicon Valley type, a software products, people say about this product trio, right? Which is like a product manager, product designer, and engineer. So a three functions, So how can we translate it into audio, right? Is this the same, or or I have some thoughts too, but what are yours, right?
Yeah, I'm curious about your thoughts too. But I think the way I think about it is one of the things about our industry is that the companies tend to be pretty small. We're a niche industry. There are a few exceptions to that, and there's, I think, some things are happening now in the industry where there's companies are consolidating and getting bigger. Like that happened with Isotope, my previous employer, where they became part of Native Instruments and Plugin Alliance, and they all merged together and became a bigger company. And there's some DAW companies, you work for one of those, that are bigger and have more resources. But a lot of, especially if you're talking about plugins, I was just looking back through, my previous jobs and thinking about it. And it's when I was at Cakewalk, it was maybe 50 people. I was at Isotope when it was between 10 and 50 people when I was there. Sound Toys was 15 people, I think, when I was there. And UA is like the biggest company I've ever worked for. It's like 250, 300 people. So in the grand scheme of things, compared to other industries, we have a really small industry with smaller companies. And so I think, that's one thing to think about, is that the UX role, it's very rare that you're going to meet somebody that's just a UX designer. I guess that's the main point I'm trying to make. My current title is I'm, a UX and UI designer. So I'm doing UX design, increasingly doing more user research and things like that. And UX design can involve things like doing wireframes and mock-ups and interactive prototypes, and just thinking through the less visual details of how a design is supposed to work. And then I'm also doing the final graphic design on a lot of things, and that's just kind of I think a necessity, because we're a small team within the product team. There's actually, within the product team at UA, there are product managers, there are sonic designers, there are people that handle that are more subject matter experts on synths or guitar effects and amps, or studio effects. And then there's a team of just two of us that are UI UX designers for the whole company on the software side anyway. And there's other contractors and things like that we work with, but at least on the software side, it's just Manny, my boss, and me. And so and we do a lot of the UX, but I should mention that also, UX really in every company I've ever worked for has been pretty much a shared discipline across roles.
Yep.
So when I say that you're not going to find a lot of UX designers in audio, I think it's, like I said earlier, like for me, I discovered as a product manager that a lot of what I was doing was UX design. And I still think that that's true. I think a lot of the product managers that I work with day to day have a great sense of, user experience sensibility and are always thinking about the customer. And so, but as far as the particular skills, some of them have more training than others in sort of, user experience design as a skill, but those are skills that you can pick up even if that's not your title, I guess is another way to put it. So yeah, I think that's sort of the small nature of audio companies in general. Like, that's how the role in my experience has fit in. You may find somebody that's either a combination UX and graphic designer, or you may find a product manager who's also doing, really part of their job is going to be figuring out the user experience of a product in addition to the logistics of, managing the product through the process of releasing it and working on the business side of it as well. What's your experience like? What have you seen?
Well, I would say mostly two things, So one you already mentioned, I mean, both actually were those that you already mentioned. One that, like a sonic design or there must, like usually there is an engineer, and here is actually two like a sides of engineering, because you have like a software engineering, so people who build plugins, like a software, some kind of programming frameworks. But then you have also those who are actually like build the sound or somehow are like involved on this creative side. And secondly, that those roles very often are merged, like you say, right? So like a very often product person is really like a like a design person. I was actually, for the first time when I worked in anything audio, I was just surprised there is just so few designers, right, across the like helping everyone. It's just in any sort of like a brand I looked into, or like a I'm speaking because of the podcast to many people. So I was just, that's like that's so weird, right? I mean, there's just so few people like helping out, right? Mostly doing like a UI, I would say, right? And I can often see that actually product managers very often being the like making the UX part, and actually going to people who are called UX designers, but actually doing just mostly like a polishing the prototypes, But so that's kind of things I see. I think mostly, with exception, I think of Isotope, right? I mean, that's just. I mean, so many people I speak to, I can see that it looks like Isotope was a company that like where in like a audio UX sort of like flourished from, right? I mean, that's very often I hear like Isotope mentioned, right? So
yeah, I think that was. Yeah, it's funny to think that I was there before that, like UX was a function there, before any of us knew what UX was, and we were, that was sort of that was kind of an interesting process, because by the time I left in 2014, I had hired a couple people as product designers as their title that were kind of complementing the product manager function. So that was actually something that we had worked through at that point. Was like, I specifically dropped my product manager title, and my friend Alex Wester, who worked there, kind of took over the product management department and managed product managers, and I kind of was managing designers. And so that was kind of like a very intentional division of labor that we had, because we kind of realized that there was, as the company was growing, product management was kind of turning into a different function than the UX design thing. So, but yeah, but that was a benefit of the company growing too. It's like the company could afford to hire more people and have more specialized roles, rather than having to have people constantly switching hats, or hire a contractor to do, design on one product because we didn't have enough resources to do it. So
yeah. So we should actually call this podcast actually how did I start audio UX, right? Yeah. All right, listen, I mean, so can you just like say what is your like a typical like a workflow, so yeah, so how do you like what is your like a design process, so to speak, if not necessarily in UA, but I mean generally what is your like approach to the designing products? Yeah.
I think in general, I mean, it kind of always starts from words rather than mock-ups or sketches. Like there's always maybe that's coming from my background as like a writer and then as a product manager, but like I think you got to have a clear spec. You got to know what you're trying to build, and whether that comes from the product manager or it's something that you do as a team. Like you kind of need a clear idea of the thing that you're trying to build and who it's for. So almost always at UA there's kind of a spec that we're working from, and a product manager has thought through who the customer is going to be, like what needs they have at a high level, and maybe they've got a rough idea of how it should be configured or work, but maybe not so much the idea of the specifics of how it's going to be arranged or all that. Sometimes they do. So sometimes product managers will sketch stuff out and start, and you'll start with that. Or more often than not, it's a collaborative process where you're working with product managers to kind of work through different iterations of, okay, so these are the controls that you think this plugin needs to have, or the features that this plugin needs to have. Like, how do we present that, and how do we arrange it so that it's understandable? And then you get into either sketching by hand. I definitely do a lot of stuff in notebooks in early stages. I've got a notebook sitting next to me right now where I've sketched out an EQ draft for something. And then the stage after that is usually working in Figma. I mean, I love Figma. It's a great tool for just sketching out ideas and building out different iterations of a potential product design. Usually it starts out pretty, what we call wireframes, where it's just black and white. You're not trying to get into the visual details yet. And then and it kind of proceeds from there. Like usually at some point, you may, if it's a more complex plugin or DAW or whatever, you may actually build a functioning clickable prototype in Figma so that you can kind of see if you're navigating between screens, or if you're opening and closing menus and things like that. You can get a sense of how that works and maybe even test it with people. And then usually then at that point, once you're fairly certain, you kind of know the overall direction and that it's not going to change too much. Sometimes it still does change a lot, but if you're pretty confident, then you can get into mocking up the actual final look and feel, which typically that may happen in something like Photoshop. It may involve using 3D tools like Cinema 4D is the main one that I use. And then you're kind of creating sort of a rough version of what the product's going to look like that's more fleshed out. And then it just kind of, you get more and more detailed from there. And there's usually a ton of refinement through throughout the whole course of the product as it gets more and more finely detailed. And then and then hopefully you're testing stuff with people. That's something that we've been working on a lot at UA, is trying to involve users earlier in the process so that we can show rougher ideas to people. Because I think one thing that I've witnessed in every audio company I've ever worked for is that testing is time consuming. It's recruiting people is hard. It takes time. But every company has a beta testing group. So usually what will happen is a product will get to beta, and you'll have worked on this thing for 6 months or a year or whatever. Then it goes out to beta, and that's when you get like the real, like people are seeing it for the first time that aren't close to the product. And then you get tons of useful feedback. And sometimes hopefully you don't get surprised by something being really wrong. And like, wow, people really just didn't get that thing we did, or didn't really understand how this part was supposed to work. And hopefully you have time to correct that. But
this is already when the code is there, right? I mean, that's So do you do like some, usability testing, like with early prototypes, showing to the users, potential users? You have also this kind of group that can, that you can test your ideas against?
Yeah, that's something that we're trying to do more and more, because it is really helpful. And I've done that in previous companies as well, where just even if you just have a rough prototype of something, even if it isn't interactive. But there are limits, though. I think that's sort of one of the challenges in audio, is that so much of the user experience of the products is how they sound. And if you're not getting the feedback of how something sounds when you're moving a control, like, you don't really know, like, is the taper of that EQ control correct? Like, does it sound correct? Is it how people expect it to sound? Is it a useful range for people to EQ that vocal with? There's so many nuances in audio that are just not visual. They're actually, so it's tough, because I think sometimes some things you can show early on and get feedback on, but it's always great to be able to get to the point where you have a working product and be able to show that to people as well, because the audio portion of our products is so important.
Yep, gotcha. By the way, if I can just stop for just a second and say that we share right now the link to to the podcast on YouTube. So if you guys want to give a soup and sort of this a 10th episode, there is plenty of episodes with a colleague from Nick's company, Rodrigo, and also other people from renowned companies, from my company, from Avid, from Native Instruments, from Audio Kinetics, so a game audio, you can just watch all those episodes there just for free. And also speaking of user research, we also share the super short survey, which is actually mostly designed, to learn, what you would like to hear next, right? So and obviously, a few questions. I mean, it's really a 1 minute to fill 3 questions, right? So what are your challenges, and we would like to hear, so this will help us, so to of course I have, plenty of guests lined up, but I mean, it's obviously great to know what you would like to hear next. And also another a request, and we have a colleague sort of in the in the backstage in the studio. Vagi, would you be able to pull maybe a picture of a Sound City studio, and while we discuss, we're just trying to pull it, but I don't want to sort of disrupt the conversation.
I tried to pull it up in Logic, so I could try to share my screen again. Maybe it'll work better than Ableton did for me. If you want to, then we can actually move around in it and stuff. Let's see, share screen.
I know that we have plenty of designers, so if we talk about Sound City Studio, I'm sure they know. But for those, now we are speaking.
Yeah. Okay, I'm just trying to share my whole screen this time. This will work.
Yeah, that sounds.
Yeah, so this this is one of the plugins that I worked on at UA. We released it a couple of years ago, and as you can see, there's a lot of it's a model of a room. This is from Sound City Studios in LA, which is a famous recording studio that a lot of classic records were recorded in.
Nirvana.
Nirvana, for example, and also Fleetwood Mac back in the 70s, and many artists in between. So really, with this was a fun plugin to work on, because I think I got to combine some sort of this sort of more skeuomorphic or realistic hardware-like interfaces with more modern UI elements, and that was sort of part of what we decided to do from the beginning, was to have this main view where it's really kind of this immersive studio view where you can actually directly interact with things like mics. So if I want to move a mic closer to the drum kit, I can do that. So you actually can physically place mics in the space, and you can choose different positions in the room even. So for
it's hot.
If I, for example, choose the piano, there's another corner that the camera faces into, and I can move these mics up and down. So this was as opposed to just showing knobs and sliders or whatever, which we had another product called Ocean Way Studios that was a number of years before this that I didn't work on, that had kind of a little tiny view of the studio, and then there's some knobs and sliders and stuff like that. So the fun thing about this product was we really brought that to be the main view. and made it interactive. But there's still the ability to open up a mixer view and to interact with some of the stuff in this kind of interface as well. So we kind of tried to have it both ways and make it, you can get into some deeper, more, audio engineer like tools if you open up this side panel. But when you're in the main panel, you kind of have the basics. You can turn effects on and off. You have an EQ and dynamics that you can turn on and off. You can control your master volume. You can control your level of your microphones, and you can move microphones around. So we kind of tried to have. This is something that a lot of UA interfaces and isotope interfaces and other companies do, is to try to, have the product work at different levels for people with different needs or different experience levels. So this product can work totally well just by choosing presets. And presets are a huge part of UX for audio products, because they give people, useful starting points without having to, tweak a million controls. So you have presets, you have like a simple view, which is this view. And then you also have like advanced views where you can get in and really, I know exactly how I want to set my compressor, so I'm going to go do that. But not everybody, not everybody's going to want to go to that deep level.
Gotcha. That's this, it's that's like when I saw it for the first time, I say, oh yeah, that's like a ultimate, UI and UX of the plugin. Honestly, that's so like a great job, man. It's like I really love it. I really love it. It's just
shout out to Will Shanks, who is the product manager, and Manny, who also helped me with the UI, and everybody at UA. It's a great team that works on these products. So I don't want to take too much credit for this, but for me, a lot of what I worked on was the UX design and the final graphic design for this, which I stayed up a lot of late nights rendering out microphones, because there's a ton of microphones in this product.
So I have a question here. Listen, how much, so from your experience, if you have for example, like a newbie, like a UX designer who like to join the industry, how much, from your perspective, how much like a audio engineering knowledge a person should have, understanding, all the, dynamics, and audio reparation, generally, does it, is it enough to work with some audio engineers as a peer, or you should actually have some knowledge in order to join?
Oh, that's a good question. I think, I think it's helpful to have some knowledge. Maybe it's not 100% necessary. I think that, as I mentioned earlier, I think oftentimes product managers or sonic designers at UA are sort of the subject matter experts. So they have a lot of the knowledge of, how, if we're working on a guitar product, like James, who I work with, is like a guitar guru. Like, he knows pretty much everything you'd ever want to know about amps and pedals and guitars. So, you have expertise behind you as a designer. Whereas in other roles that I've been in, like when I was at Isotope, I was doing kind of a combination of those things. So I really had to, if I didn't know about an area like mastering, like I was working on Ozone a lot of the time, but I was never a mastering engineer. I knew a little bit about mastering, but I really relied on, getting out and talking to mastering engineers. So I think it helps to at least have an interest in audio and have some background in it, even if you don't really consider yourself an expert in a particular area. I think that's okay. I think you just have to be willing to learn. You have to have an interest in it and be willing to learn it, or surround yourself with people that know, how all that stuff works. So that you can be an effective designer.
This is interesting what you're saying. Like last time when we spoke with Rodrigo, he's also there was somebody who asked the question, how much technical knowledge you need to have in order to be a product manager, and he also said none, right? Which was a surprise to me, because I always felt a little bit intimidated, when people talk about a merge requests and pipelines, and creating a release of the product, So here, it's but I understand that. Yeah, that's just as long as you're just willing to learn. I think one thing is that I just still find, amazing that whoever I just meet in the industry, people are so super humble, and some of them are actually like with like 30 years of experience, like a Grammy records, right? And I mean, doing, I mean, as you like you say, knowing like the industry inside out, and I mean, like amazing musicians, something I could potentially like never dream of, and then they still like a super humble, and as long as you're just like a super passionate, I mean, everybody's so super happy to to teach you, right? So that's I mean, it's
100%. Yeah, that's my experience too. Yeah, that's one of the reasons that I love working in audio and music is that, well, first of all, I just love audio and music. So even though I'm not a pro at making music or recording, just a bedroom, musician and music maker, I guess. Yeah, everybody that I meet is really, super. If you have something in common with them, they will.
Absolutely, that's the same, 100% the same experience. Yeah, well, I just last week I was to Superbooth, in Berlin, so I'm just still energized because it was 3 days, it's just this Berlin show that is so a non-commercial, I would say, although it's obviously a trade show, and everybody's just. By the way, just my entire AV team was there as well, so I could just high five my friends and peers.
That's
and
awesome.
I mean, there's so many it's just so so great, three scenes, in the sand music for 3 days, and yeah. And I know that some people who are actually listening were there as well, so I couldn't meet everyone, but I mean, I mean, I was just for 2 days, but yeah, that's 100% agree. Yeah, well, listen, maybe I know that we have this idea that we'll do a conversation and then questions, but I can see there are just number of them coming, so maybe we can just a small a break and actually see what's coming on the number of questions. Otherwise we may actually not be able to answer them all. Okay, so let me just quickly browse through them.
Just quickly, Alexander, the 3D stuff on Sound City was mostly me.
Oh yeah, okay, that's
so that, and oftentimes we do, we both Manny and I, who are the sort of full-time designers at UA, we both use 3D tools, and yeah, that's just part of the gig, I guess, for doing these kinds of plugins.
What kind of tech stack do these plugins have? What front-end and technology do they use to translate your design?
I'm not sure how much I can share specifically about the tech stack, but I will say that with a lot of audio plugin companies, a lot of you are probably familiar with Juice. So Juice is used in a lot of products throughout our industry, and I've worked on a lot of plugins over the years that have used Juice. And also, some companies are using, sort of HTML based and CSS based front ends. So yeah, I think it varies, and I think every company has kind of put together their own sort of combination of tools to actually render UIs. And kind of I hinted to before, I sometimes wish that we had the level of having a game engine or something like that, so that when we do something like Sound City, we wouldn't have to render out all these images. We could actually have stuff rendering in real time. And some companies have tried to do that, but I haven't seen. Maybe some of you on the call know of companies that have pulled that off, but I haven't seen a lot of really 3D immersive graphic extensions and plugins.
I can name one actually. Although I would say that from the user perspective, I mean, hopefully, I don't offend anyone from the company, because I love the the idea. It's called VSL, a Vienna Synchron Orchestra.
Oh yeah,
they have this player Synchron, but the company is called VSL, right? And do this a Vienna Orchestra. So all these libraries.
Yeah, I know
since
Vienna,
they're just a 3D, I think it's immersive recorded with Ambisonics mics, so you can place, but it's again, it's not maybe 100% super, immersive, but having, orchestral sections, that you can manually put into different rooms. And I know that you have even a different rooms that you can choose from, right? Or some kind of a halls, concert halls, and famous I don't know, even cathedrals, something like that, right? So they not only render you can place the instruments, but obviously have the specifics of a trying to find one yet. I mean, any ideas, other ideas? I mean, but that's one actually drew my attention. Although I have to say that I got once NFR, to test this one, and there is actually some crazy you need to have some kind of server that you need to I mean, and I'm just how to say that. So I understand that it can be like a super sophisticated, tool, but I mean, it doesn't work like a typical plugin that you open DAW, like a scan and you just open a track and play. But there is actually some kind of like a standalone application. There's some kind of a server that's connects. You have to put them into some kind of tracks, and then you somehow connect it with your DAW. It was like a rocket science for me. So I'm very rarely sort of quickly run away from a plugin, but I mean that was too much, and especially I was super busy, overwhelmed, just wanted to sort of check out, and I said no, that's not going to work for me, well, but just so a first time user experience, so how can I
yeah, it sounds complicated.
It sounds complicated, yeah, but I mean,
but powerful. I think that's the challenge sometimes, right? Because we expect these tools to be really powerful and to be able to do a lot of things, but then yeah, it's a challenge on the UX side to make them simple to use without crippling all the features.
Yeah, but you see, I mean, that comes, another question comes with what we discussed. But once again, I mean, I didn't want to sort of blast the company. On the contrary, I just find this Vienna 3D amazing, right? I try to once do some orchestral. Oh, thanks. What is the question? C4D.
Oh yeah, I answered this on. So C4D is Cinema 4D. So he's asking about 3D tools. So yeah, Cinema 4D. I started out using Blender originally, but at some point transitioned to Cinema 4D. I haven't used Blender for a number of years, but I've heard it's gotten pretty cool. And then different renderers depending on the project. I currently really like Redshift, and I've used Arnold a lot in the past as well for rendering.
Yeah, I can say, Wojtek, let's talk. The guest talk more, please. All right, I'll shut up.
Oh no, now I have to think of what to say. It's intimidating.
I have one question. For first-time user experience. So what are your thoughts on this one?
Oh, I'm sorry. The question went away. What was the question?
Like a first-time user, onboarding clients, and actually a first-time user experience. How to make this a onboarding easy and
Yeah, I think onboarding is a problem for lots of products, right? And if you're like we were just talking about with if you have a really complex product, it can be intimidating for somebody using it for the first time. So yeah, I think there are some different ways of dealing with that. I mean, some of it is, if you can simplify the product so that it's understandable at a glance, that's always ideal. You can have things like tutorials where you walk people through different steps, or like an example project. I've seen that in a lot of DAWs and other programs recently, where somebody doesn't, they're using something for the first time. You might give them a very focused walkthrough. A lot of products have things like tooltips where if you hover over something, you can get some information about the thing that you're hovering over. That can be really useful. It can also be really annoying if you're an advanced user, but hopefully there's a way to turn that off. One thing I really like, actually, Alexander was bringing up Cinema 4D, which is a 3D program I use. One feature that I love in that I use all the time is that pretty much on anything in the program you can right click on and it will send you to the manual. There's just an option, right click, and it sends you right to the paragraph in the user manual that explains that feature. And that's something that I wish I would see more in audio products. Because sometimes you just have to, if it's a highly technical thing, you might just need to read the manual. And but yeah, obviously, ideally, if you can design an interface that people will intuitively understand the first time they look at it, that's the goal. But I think it's also just important to recognize that audio products, there's a certain level of complexity that people may need to do what they want to do. So you don't want to take away too much of that complexity. You want to try to help manage it for people, but you don't want to I mean, not to say that there aren't great plugins that are one knob. That's definitely true. But in some cases, somebody may want more control over, dialing in a vocal sound or EQing a guitar or, getting exactly the right synth sound. So finding a balance between, making it simple for everybody, but also, having depth is just a constant challenge for audio products, I think.
So what are like parts of UI that are critical and, to design early on, and which, can be like a maybe evolve later?
Critical skills to
No,
gain
I mean,
early
what
on?
if you just create like a design? So is there any critical elements that have to be nailed early on during the project, or?
That's a good question. I think it probably depends on the needs of the project in some way, but for me, I think always understanding layout and hierarchy is very important. Like that's kind of the first thing I always want to know when I start working on a sketch of something or a wireframe of something, is like what goes where and why. Like trying to figure out what's important for people to see first, and placing that in a way that they'll discover it. And what needs to be on that first page? Like, is there some stuff that you can put somewhere else? Like, is there an advanced view, or what can go into menus versus what needs to be out all the time? So I think that stuff is often challenging, but really sets the tone for the whole product. If you are aiming to have like a really clean, consistent user experience, you kind of have to figure out the layout, the hierarchy of controls, and that's often that's what tools like Figma are great for, because you can just experiment, and before you get into fancy 3D rendered or flashy graphics, you just gotta just move circles and squares around the screen and figure out what goes where and why, and talk through it with people. I think that's super important to nail down, because it's hard once you get into like the visual design and final graphic design. It's harder to iterate. It's harder to go back and change things. But then there's also this kind of paradox where sometimes people don't pay attention in a certain way until something looks pretty. So it's like sometimes you want to throw out a version of something that's like a little bit polished, so that people will see it and say, oh yeah, then they start to really understand the emotional aspect of the product, and as opposed to just seeing some black and white
100%,
stuff on the screen.
100%.
So there's a time for that, but it is, I think, early on in the process, it's really good to just work in black and white and get stuff in get the rough outline of what you're trying to do together.
Gotcha. So do you have any at UA like a design system or like some kind of UI toolkit that some questions? I mean, you're looking for the questions?
I think design systems, that's a good question. I remember there was a time around 2015, 16, where like absolutely everybody was talking about design systems and saying you must have a design system. And I think it was a period of time when like Figma started to, Sketch and Figma started to become really popular, and it became possible to make like component-based designs more easily. And it enabled you to make design systems that were reusable, and that you could have components that were well documented and all this stuff. And I would say we don't have anything that formal, but we do have a lot of like component-based designs that have sort of, whether they're written down or not, they have rules about, if you're looking at Luna, which is our DAW, that's something that Manny, my boss, worked a lot on before I even came to UA. That was released about the time I came to UA. And there's a whole, like when I've had to work on things in Luna, like he did a really good job of like designing all these different components. And if there's a menu in Luna, it works a certain way. If there's a button in Luna, it works a certain way. So I think that, whenever you've got a complex product that has a lot of moving pieces, then you kind of have to set out some kind of design system, even if it's not a formally, built out design system in Figma. You kind of have to have rules and guidelines and and sort of ideas about how things should work and what kind of controls you should use for certain kinds of things. For things like UA Connect is one product that I worked on, and that's UA sort of like downloader and licensing app. So if you want to download any UA plugins or authorize your subscription or update your software, you do it through UA Connect.
Yeah, I do have it here.
Yep. You kind of have to have it if you have UA products now. But that's one that I worked on, and that design was done in Figma. And I didn't take it as far as having like a design system that I could publish, but I did try to build everything as components in Figma so that I could reuse things, or that if some other designer needed to work on it later, they wouldn't have to design a button from scratch. They could take a button that was already built and change the text in it, and the button would resize and all of that. So I think that's sort of as close as I've come to making a design system at UA. And I think design systems are cool, but they require labor, they require effort to maintain. And if you have a design team of 2 people or 3 people or 4 people, making a whole design system may be overkill.
Yeah.
But what is important is to have, to document somehow, how you want, to have some kind of design guidelines for, how things should work, and to have a shared understanding in the design team of how, things in this product work or this product work. But as far as like some companies probably have a design system across all their products as well, and that's something that UA definitely doesn't do. Whereas if you look at, I'm trying to think of an example of a company that has very similar looking products that are styled maybe slightly differently. Yeah, I guess maybe, Soundtoys was a little bit like that where I used to work, where, if you have like a product like Echo Boy or Tremolator or a lot of their plugins, they use basically the same design system. Like they have the same knobs, they have the same, like if there's a display that's showing some, menu, it looks the same in pretty much all their plugins. And that it's nice to sometimes have reusable elements like that. But I think in UA, especially in the plugins, we tend to have a lot of variety in the plugins. And I think that is, that's a design decision and sort of a product decision that, I think it's great to have like a wide variety of styles of UIs. And maybe you lose something in consistency, but you gain something in, if you have a vintage compressor, it can look like a vintage compressor. If you have a more modern tool that has, that's more visually rich, you can have that. And you don't need to go back to use the components that are officially blessed as part of the design system. You have more freedom to make a unique plugin for the specific thing at hand.
I never thought about it early, but now when you brought this one up, I mean, honestly, wouldn't like to have this kind of like a unified design over everything. It's actually great that there are plugins that look differently, and they actually like reflect, like you say, some are modern, some are vintage, and that's like it, hardware. That's the same thing, right? And you can like surround yourself with like various things, right? And you just like some stock plugins from, I don't know, some DAW, etc. It's just like all the same. No, it looks like it's even like a bit tiring, right? That is all like super consistent. I
mean, it can be very cool. Like Alexander's bringing up like Valhalla, DSP, FabFilter. Those are great examples of like, I love their plugins, and they've got their own style that is, carried across their plugins, and they have, variations between them. So I think it can work, but also, in one place where you want to have that consistency is something like a DAW. Like if you're working in Pro Tools or Luna, like you don't want to open up one menu and have it look different from another menu. If you're in the mixer view, you don't want it to be stylistically too different from your session view or your track view. So I think there's a place for like very consistent design systems, but I think there's also, especially in plugins, like variety can be awesome as well.
That's what I meant, plugin mainly. Yeah. So like it's like you have different gear, it just replicates the idea that you have different gear around you, right? But I mean, this system, it's just gotcha. Listen, so shall we take more comments? I mean, you can see they're just coming, a lot of them coming. So except for me being, I can. Okay, it's like one. I saw 3D demo. That's amazing. But as a user, what is the design that designing for? What does the problem that's design solve? I want more explanation, please. I know nothing about music. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay, that's a great question. I think, let's talk about Sound City, which is the plugin that I pulled up earlier.
Mm-hmm.
I think the problem that solves for is, if you're a user that's recording in a home studio, you part of the sound of these classic recordings is recording in a real space that has the acoustics of a big studio. Like if you put a drum kit in a big studio and you mic it up in a certain way, it's going to be very recognizable as sounding, if you listen to records by Nirvana or Fleetwood Mac or other records that were recorded in that studio, the room and the microphones impart a certain sound to that recording. So, of course, we could present that stuff in a very simple way. We could just have a rectangle with a couple drop-down menus where you could choose the microphone you want. You could choose, a drum kit. You could choose a microphone. That's one way of solving the problem, would be just to give somebody, a list of options that they could choose from. And you could say, yeah, that solves the problem. I could make my drum kit sound like it was recorded in this famous recording studio. But another way to solve the problem is to make a whole, to recreate the space in the plugin and let people actually drag the microphones around so that they can put them exactly where they want them, and to, give people a sense of what would be really happening in the real studio. And I think that I saw that in a couple of reviews too, that like there's one particular reviewer, White Sea Studio. Do any of you know this White Sea Studio? I can't remember the guy's name. I think he's in the Netherlands, but he's great because he's very critical of a lot of plugins and a lot of audio products. Like he doesn't put up with he likes to call things snake oil if he thinks they're not. If you put a 3D user interface on something and it's he'll call it out if it's not helpful. But he actually gave Sound City a great review, and he said, you know what, I think this is actually helping me understand what's happening with the microphones in the room, and I like this. So that was like probably one of the biggest compliments I've ever had as a designer, because he's typically so critical of 3D user interfaces. So I was like, yeah, okay, he gets it. This is what we were trying to do. So I hope that answers it. I mean, it's kind of, yeah, I mean, there are multiple ways to solve the same problem. And I think a lot of it is, we're working in a really unique industry where people have, nostalgia for recording studios. Yeah.
Nick, before we just jump to this one, I mean,
Yeah.
if I can just like add maybe on the top of it, it's just like a lot of like a sound design is really like experimentation. Like, I mean, if you like listen to some people say like a favorite, like a bands, you can hear and they say, hey, I was actually experimenting, like putting my closer and then, like a farther from the amp, etc. You can like watch like interviews from like Brian May, right? You say, I mean, I was like an idea that I will put a mic like behind the amp, right? So it will actually have some specific echo and it will create like a specific design. So I think, also it's so you can replicate this idea of like you being a sound designer who are in the room and are sort of like a play with different settings and actually see how that sound, right? So that's, I think.
Yeah, experimenting is, yeah. And that's something that I think about a lot as a designer too. And that I thought about as a product manager as well, and that I know other PMs and designers I work with think about, is that you kind of, a lot of like great things have happened in the history of recorded music because people use things in a way that wasn't exactly how you intended them to. When you think about like the classic drum machines, or like the TB303, the bassline synth from Roland, that people used to create an entirely new genre of music. Acid house was made out of people misusing something that was made to replace a bass player in a band, as just a practice tool or as a performance tool. So people twist technology in creative ways, and that's sort of part of the gig. It's part of the industry. And so I always think about that when I'm working on products. Is like, you don't always want to take everything out that's a little weird or on the edges. It's like you want to leave room for people to explore and do weird stuff. Like that's part of the fun of all of this, really.
You see, I'll make a new rule. Like, how can I misuse a specific, like a specific gear? Like, what can I sort of, yeah. But that's 100%. Like, like 808, I think it was initially redesigned just to make just to rehearse, right? Just to practice and then become an instrument, right, of its own. And even with Sound City, when I watched this documentary, I just learned that it wasn't like a, purposefully designed as a studio. Somebody just learned that this, room has a super specific acoustic that sounds so great, right?
Yeah.
Not like a
acoustician. Yeah, and like it should, on paper, it shouldn't work. Like it's just a big box or whatever, and it just happened to sound great for drums, and they figured that out.
Yeah. So there was actually, So apart from Blender, apart from Blender, C4D, what other software do you use? Do you also work with Photoshop, Figma? Which one you find more useful for your work? Or lastly, are there any new tool software that you are interested in learning? Oh, good one.
Oh, great question. Pretty much, I use all of these. Photoshop. I mean, Figma is the tool for doing, if you want to do mock-ups, wireframes, interactive, prototypes. It's just really an essential tool for all kinds of interface designers, not just audio interface designers. And then, Photoshop, I still use Photoshop pretty much every day. When you're doing these sort of realistic plugin interfaces, I end up using a combination of Cinema 4D, After Effects, Photoshop for that stuff a lot of the time. And so they're all, those are all useful tools. And I think it really depends on what you're trying to do. And if you're, if you're trying to make physically realistic looking stuff, you're probably going to need to use something like Blender or Cinema 4D. Photoshop, you can kind of fake stuff in Photoshop, but I know some designers that are really, really skilled at using Photoshop to do that kind of stuff. But it's in some ways easier to use a tool like Cinema 4D or Blender. And After Effects is just a really useful tool whenever you're working with, getting footage out of a 3D application into, something else. So I use After Effects a lot for that reason as well.
Gotcha.
As far as new tools, just to answer that part of it, that's a good question. I mean, I think I'm kind of intrigued by some of the AI tools that are out there, but I haven't found them to be very good yet. I have used things like Midjourney to create textures and things like that. I'll share like a little Easter egg about Sound City. Anytime you see a rug in Sound City Studios, it was made using Midjourney. I made a bunch of rug textures in Midjourney and then brought them into 3D because I couldn't find any realistic looking sort of, Persian Oriental style rugs, and I wanted some to put underneath the drum kits. So, so I think there's like places for AI tools like that are useful, but I think as far as like 3D modeling, I haven't found a lot of tools that have really sped up my process yet. But I guess we'll see.
I'm just trying to find, because recently somebody sent me some UX tool for, AI tool, but I cannot just find it right now. Yeah, but I was just curious also, what do you think? So you're saying not yet. So you're curious, but you can't find any, I mean, not just for 3D, but in general, anything except for Midjourney in the realm of AI, or not yet?
What was there? There's one called Meshy, which is supposed to create, I think it's called Meshy. Like you're supposed to be able to use it to create like 3D objects that you could then use in Blender or Cinema 4D. And I'm kind of intrigued by that idea because that is very time consuming. If you want to recreate a specific knob or a specific, guitar pedal or something like that, it can take a lot of time to do that well. So it'd be nice to be able to speed some of that stuff up so you could just get to the fun stuff. But it's, I just have found that it's the quality output is not very good yet. So I'd rather just do it manually. And I think I'm finding that with a lot of 3D or with a lot of AI tools in general. It's sort of like they can get you like 80% of the way there sometimes, but the detail is just not there. Like exactly what you want to happen isn't happening. And sometimes it can be very hard to prompt an AI tool to give you exactly what you want. So it's easier sometimes to just make it yourself and more fun to make it yourself. So I don't know. Yeah. I'm kind of skeptical. Alexander was saying that he's saying AI is the new snake oil. I don't know. I'm kind of on board with that. I don't know. I think there could be some really cool uses for it in design, but I'm also very skeptical and worried about it in some ways.
Yeah, I hear you. I mean, it's the same like with language, people are so hyped about writing, with AI, but I mean, the content sometimes is just like it's just like a word salad, as people used to say, right? There's a lot of like a meaningless, and I know that somebody maybe who doesn't read books, etc., people are more, I would say, I'm just, I can see that people are more used to, sort of this kind of word salad and, like not using language properly, their own language properly. Yeah, that's a, yeah.
Well, I think about some of the jobs that I had early on in my career. Like I worked in an ad agency for a while, and I was a copywriter, and I wrote advertisements and things like that. And that job was just terrible. Like there's only so many ways that you can, say that a bank offers free checking accounts. Like it's really, so I would love to have had AI during that job because it was not really, I think the promise of AI is that it could help us to do more creative work and sort of like make it so that we can automate some of the less fun, less creative work. But unfortunately, it seems like it could end up being the opposite, where
exactly.
AI is going to steal our intellectual property of all the designers and all the people making audio plugins and all the people doing great art all around the world and spit out, imitations of that.
Sorry, I have to sorry, I'm just like so excited to ask you another one because the question that comes from what you say is actually, so what is your opinion? Do you think it can happen that they AI will take use designers' work in the future? It's like a change the, or like a sort of like a limit, I would say, that like a number of designers required in the industry will be way smaller.
I think it's hard to say yet. I think, like I said, it just seems so hard to get the tools as they are today. Just don't have the level of detail and precision. So at least today, you still need a human to really refine a design and make it work.
I mean,
especially
more
if you're
in the future,
delivering.
right? So what are you like? Do you think it can happen, let's say in 5-10 years, that we really will be like a AI-driven company? I know that a lot of people are sort of crazy about
it's really hard for me to imagine how it's going to be, because I think some people think that we're going to have artificial general intelligence within the next few years, in which case everybody's jobs are going to fundamentally change, not just designers. So yeah, I mean, I absolutely think it's possible that AI is going to replace designers and all kinds of workers, but I'm not sure what to do about that. Other than I think we kind of all have to, I think being plugged into what's happening with AI is useful. I mean, to be able to understand the tools and what their limitations are is good, and you're going to be able to. I think that's like advice I would give is just stay plugged in to what's happening with design, so you understand where you're going to fit in as the world changes. Because I think humans are going to still be doing jobs, but I'm not sure what my job as a designer is going to be like 5 years from now. I'm not sure what the things that are going to be automated are, and what the things that is going to be important for me as a human with design experience are going to be. Maybe it'll be less 3D modeling and more art directing, or maybe it'll be maybe it'll be more product management and less hands-on design. It's hard to say.
Yeah. Well, I'm just like always, I mean, it's not my joke. I mean, a lot of people sort of laugh that, if we fire all juniors and there will be only seniors managing AI, who will become seniors in the future, right?
Yeah. Well, the AI.
when we pass away, right? Yeah, that's the good one. Okay, so let's have a look. By the way, I'm not sure if I can advertise already. We have still some time and a few questions, but I mean, sure. In terms of a future, the upcoming guest on the podcast will be VP from Roland, who's actually in charge of the Future Design Lab. So it's a group of engineers who only do some crazy stuff, but I mean do really crazy stuff. What would be playing the instruments in this deep space? When we move to to some space stations, and when entire Earth is already inhabitable. This kind of crazy. I mean, obviously more down to earth stuff as well, like virtual reality, composing music, right? We mentioned already some designs in the virtual reality, right? So that kind of thing. Yes, so will be more about some sort of future these trends.
Okay, I'm curious about that. I'm looking forward to that one.
Yeah, that will be a good one. Okay, so one more questions. What are biggest challenges you face when designing UI such as major brands, and how do you overcome them? Are there any recent trends or innovation in GUI design that you are excited about or planning to implement? Good one.
Oh yeah, good question. Biggest challenges. I would say one of the biggest challenges is, and I would say this for audio companies in general, is that um, everybody that I work with is really passionate and knowledgeable about audio stuff, and so you have to navigate a lot of opinions. And I've worked as a freelancer, I've worked for companies before that were just so happy to just let me do. They trusted me as the designer. Like, oh yeah, you think we should do it that way? Okay, you're the expert. We're going to let you. That's few and far between. Usually, clients will have an opinion, or your company will have an opinion about things. But there have been a few cases where it's like, oh yeah, you think that's the way we should do it? Go for it. But if you're working at a company where you're surrounded by people that are really passionate and have, that are one type of user, but they may not represent all of the users, but they're making music or they're an expert in some aspect of audio. Like you've got to navigate a lot of feedback and opinions, and that it's sometimes challenging. If you have a direction that you feel strongly about, you have to be good at advocating for that, and you have to be good at sort of sometimes compromising if somebody has a better idea than you, and that happens. Just because you're the designer doesn't mean that an engineer doesn't have a good design idea. So I think being humble is helpful, because you have to be able to take on feedback from people and not take it personally, and also respect the fact that other people also have expertise, but also not just let people walk all over you. You want to actually be able to assert yourself and have say, hey, you know what, this is why I think we should do it this way, and take people through your decision making process. So that's challenging. I think maybe it's a little harder as you get into a bigger company, because you have more people weighing in, more stakeholders, more designers, more marketing people. Whereas if you're at a smaller company, it's a little bit easier. You know who the 3 people you have to convince are, or whatever. And as far as recent trends or innovations in GUI design, I don't know. I'm actually kind of curious to see what the next innovation in GUI design will be for audio. I'm super curious about VR and AR. I don't see a really clear use case for it yet for audio, as far as people's practical day-to-day needs. But it is really fun to I've made a couple little GUI sketches in 3JS for that will run on an Oculus Quest. I have an Oculus Quest 2 just for playing games, and I could totally see the potential of the VR or AR experience for audio. That would be really cool. But I think I think we haven't gotten over the hurdle of the hardware being affordable, good, and people wanting to buy it and use it for this kind of stuff. I think maybe in the future it will be, but yeah, I'm kind of curious about where that's going to go, or if it's going to go anywhere. Because it's fun. I mean, being somebody that's interested in 3D stuff and immersive stuff, having more than just a flat 2-dimensional rectangle on the screen that you can interact with is very interesting. I think a lot of, I remember back in the day when I was at Isotope, I worked on a product called Stutter Edit, which had a pretty cool interface. And we worked with an external designer to do kind of the final graphic design. And I was the product manager, and it was a collaboration with this artist, BT, who had basically designed the plugin, how the plugin would work. It was sort of based on his stutter editing techniques that he developed. And I every time I was in a meeting with him, he always kept saying, he kept using Minority Report as a reference point.
Oh,
he's
yeah.
I want this to be like Minority Report. I'm like, Brian, we don't have the technology to make it like Minority Report. I know you want it to be like Minority Report, but doing that kind of experience, when you flatten that to 2 dimensions, it just kind of doesn't work. I mean, we tried to do. There are some elements in that original GUI
actually I think
we're kind of Minority Report but the whole thing with Minority Report is that you can manipulate these objects in 3D space and swipe stuff around, and I love that kind of stuff. I love that sort of film UI stuff, and it would be cool if we can get to the point where some of that would be a reality.
So listen to this. Actually, next Friday, because there is actually AES Europe convention next week in Poland, in Warsaw. And actually, I'm attending the panel with Tomasz, a friend of mine who is he was the founder of this like Ambisonics, like my company Zilia, and generally like he's researcher in the immersive space, like a like a audio engineer. And there is also a guy from Meta, like the VP from Meta, who's actually responsible for VR, AR, and a guy from like a gaming, audio gaming. There will be like a discussion about all this kind of, these people are sort of really involved in research, and not from the like a like a design UI perspective, but like a that's generally
Audio
speaking how
perspective,
this can audio and well, and also like a gaming, etc. So like hopefully, and Meta, of course, sort of like a stopped for a moment. They just sort of like changed the name and sort of wanted to create like a metaverse, and then it all somehow disappeared. But I mean, I saw some videos like people experimenting, with I don't know, like composing, in 3D. It was already like interesting, right? So I think even with existing those, but I mean somehow with I don't know, like a Apple Vision or something like this could be really, interesting. Yeah, or like some kind of like a how to say, gloves or something that you could compose or even, or how do you call it, like a like a, how do you call it, the what's the guy who's just in front of the
conductor.
Sorry.
Yeah,
So like a conductor orchestra, stuff like this. Anyway, yes, more questions. Does the concept of MVP exist in audio products? I feel like maybe it doesn't fit at all. Maybe I'm wrong. Yeah.
So yeah, MVP. So that's a minimum viable product, right? So that's sort of an idea in product development where you kind of, you put together the most simple, limited feature version of something that will meet the user's needs and release it, and then like kind of improve on it. I think it does sometimes exist in audio. I think in most of the cases, products that I worked on, I would say, I think I'm trying to say this without like generalizing too much because I'm sure it's different in some companies. But in most of the places I've worked, it's much more like developing a piece of hardware. If you're developing a plugin or something like that, where you want the features to be the fairly fully thought through when you release it, and you're not so much adding features to it later. You kind of want, you may do a version 2 of the product where you're adding some important functionality, but usually on day one, you want to kind of have the basic set of tools and features that people need to do the specific thing they're trying to do. I think maybe an exception to that would be something like Luna or like a DAW, where you could, and like I said before, like I came to UA sort of after Luna had been released, but I think that's actually one case where UA kind of does something a little bit like that, where the first version of Luna, I don't think they even called it a DAW. They called it like a recording system because it didn't have all of the features of something like Pro Tools or Logic, but it had like all the basic stuff you needed to record. And it was a really, it was very successful. And over the years, they've continued adding more and more features to it. So I think that's probably the best case I can think of at UA of something like an MVP getting shipped. But I think it's a little bit harder with something like plugins because I don't know. I think it's hard to.
Plugins are not that huge, right? Ultimately, they're not so huge. So, you don't have to like break it down into like a smaller, or if this like a plug, I understand, like a more complicated plugin, but usually plugin does one or few, things, right? And yeah, I understand, things like Ozone, where you have like a multiple, sort of, you can build entire chain. That's a different matter. Yeah. But I honestly, I don't hear so much about like a deliberately using MVP. And I don't actually see people using, there was like this comment, alpha, that this alpha beta is for this. I not necessarily like would agree. I mean, theoretically, yes, but practically, well, yeah, people want to tend to build like more like a complete product right, at first.
Yeah. I think it's helpful. I think sometimes if you're in like a kind of startup situation or you're building like a totally new product and you're trying to, get it out into the world early to see if it resonates with users and to see if people adopt it. I think that's sort of like what I've heard MVPs are, people like them for. But then then you hear stories about things like Figma. When Figma was first released, they worked on it for 3 years without releasing it. And now the founder of Figma has gone back and said, "Oh, you should be constantly releasing stuff, and don't wait 3 years to release your product." But when I look at how successful that product was, I mean, they took over the market from Sketch in like the course of a year, and I think it's because they spent 3 years working on it without releasing an unfinished product. Like they really got to a point where that product did everything that you needed as a UI designer for making websites and that kind of app, mobile apps.
Very good, very good comment. You know what? I recently heard. Actually, I spoke to a friend, from LA, who's also like a product manager, work on, like various both audio and non-audio product. He says, I call it the Silicon Valley thing, So it's like some kind of new religion, and there are just various ways people do products, and it's never there is a practice and there is theory, right? And in theory, everybody use concept. You have to do this, like a product discovery, etc. I know that people do businesses around just coaching, right? And but I mean that it can be very, very different for the very different companies.
Yeah, there's so many different, methodologies and processes that you could use. And UX design has become one of those too. Like there's things that, people that will say that you must do if you're releasing a product. You must do a journey map. You must do these things and have these artifacts. And the reality is that it just works differently in different companies and on different products. And sometimes you use certain tools and sometimes you use different tools. And sometimes things are successful and you don't use the traditional tools. So yeah, I think it varies, and you kind of have to take the tools that make sense for the product you're working on and the situation you're in.
Yep.
And whether that's making an MVP or, slaving for 3 years on something. Yeah.
Yeah. That's what I learned. Yeah. Nick, do you have, time for one more? I know that we run over, but there's actually still
one more.
Questions. Do you have an advice for designers who aspire to work in the big brands and manage high-level projects, for more entry designers and for the ones who already doing good design for audio plugins? That's a nice ending question.
It's a great question. I'm not sure I'm not sure that I'm like I don't know if like I said before, like the audio industry is so small, and UA within audio is a big brand. So I'll say that. But and like getting to UA, I think you're just gonna have to keep working at it and keep, looking for opportunities in the space that you want to work in. And I think that's sort of like, if you look back to the beginning of my career, I don't necessarily recommend going to retail. That was how I ended up getting into the audio industry. It was kind of a gamble, but it ended up working out. I'm not sure that that's exactly what I knew I wanted to do at that point, but it helped me to get into contact with people that were working in the audio tech industry. Mm-hmm. So maybe that's not the way that somebody, that's interested in that path should take. I mean, but I think that, I think just try to not compromise your career path. If what you really want to do is to work for big brands and to manage high level projects, like just try to keep that in mind as a goal, and don't go off on a path that, don't work for a brand that you don't respect. For example, like if there's a company that, offers you a job and you don't think they're in line with your values, then maybe that's something you should pass on and wait for another opportunity. But I also realize it's really hard, and especially
giving advice. Giving advice is hard, right? Giving advice is very hard. Yeah.
So, but I think also just be open-minded about what the job description is. And I think that's the other lesson I can take from looking at my own career is that, I ended up becoming a UX designer and working for a big brand, but there was a lot of smaller steps along the way, and I haven't always, just had that hat on. I've done, when I was, working at Sound Toys and the holidays rolled around and we had a lot of emails, like I would help with customer service when it was needed. Like, so don't be so, be open-minded to, if there's a place that you want to work and you see an opportunity to work there, and you see that there might be a path from that position to another position, that would be another way to think about it. Like to be flexible and understanding what your skills are and what you're willing to do, and how that fits into your goals.
Nick, maybe there's also like a worth mentioning, right, that audio is not just like a music production, right? But this is obviously like a music distribution. So there are obviously like amazing companies like, I don't know.
Oh yeah.
Bandcamp for a, or maybe let's or like a professional audio, so like a listening, you have Sonos, for example, an example, right? Obviously they have hardware, but they also have software, you can connect your, like a home studio, in an app, etc. So there are so
Yeah.
many variations of
And that's
audio.
a whole other world, yeah, that I haven't even really worked in the consumer audio world. And there, that's something Rodrigo, who was a guest before, like he worked at Beats and worked on headphones and things like that. So I always pick his brain when I see him, because I think that world is interesting to me, and that's a whole other direction you could take, other than making music production tools.
Or audio, or the game audio as well, so all these like WIs and other, other tools, which are also software tools, and I mean, amazing tools. Yeah, so that's
so the audio world is big. Like I'm pretty focused on like music creation and production, but yeah, if you're interested in audio, there's tons of other spaces that you could get involved in.
Yep. Well, there are some comments. I'm not sure. There is one, and I love. Let's have a look. I love to know more about what inspires your design work. Oh, are there any specific designers, studio, platform? That's a very nice one. Studios, platforms, even types of products that really influence your style or thinking. Oh, that's a good one.
That's a good question. And I surprisingly don't think about this as much as I should. But I think probably not surprisingly, since I work on these sort of skeuomorphic plugins, I do really like industrial designers, and people that make hardware are really inspiring to me. People like Dieter Rams. I mean, that's such a cliched answer for a designer to give, but Dieter Rams and the stuff he did for Braun is amazing. Also, like Hartmut Esslinger, who designed the first Apple Mac sort of Snow White design language, is a fantastic designer that I really admire. Giugiaro, the Italian car designer who designed like the DeLorean and Lotus Esprit and cars like that, I really always appreciated his design directions. And then as far as like software stuff, I think, things like video games are really inspiring to me. I always really love, just, video game design. And I think also film, sort of the futuristic interfaces that are in movies. Oh, one designer, this guy, Jace, who did a lot of the Marvel movies, where you have like the Iron Man, heads up display. People that work in that space, I love that kind of work. And like Minority Report came up earlier, like the kind of fictional user interfaces that are in movies are always really inspirational to me. And I'm always thinking about how could we do something like that in the plugin. So that's
a good one.
That's what I'm thinking
about. That's a very good one. Thank you. All right, I can see no more questions. Well, there's also comments.
All right. Well, thanks so much for having me. This has been really fun, and like hearing people's questions. And feel free, if anyone wants to, hit me up on LinkedIn or other platforms with questions that we didn't get to today. I'm always happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Nick. I really appreciate you coming, and the chat, So let's stop here. I mean, guys, thank you very much, for joining. And as usual, I hope, we'll see each other in June in another episode. I mean, like I mentioned, we'll just posting again, the links. You can, subscribe to YouTube channel. There will be more like some kind of, not only podcast, but some other content as well. And and the survey, if you could just give, just spend this 1 minute and like filling it out, it will be super helpful, right? Because practice what you preach, so we're talking about product management, product design. Please, like help us, to do it better. Thank you so much. And I hope I didn't speak too much, Alex. I mean, it's a conversation. It's, I mean,
it helps me too. Like it's a little intimidating with like however many people are on the call. I think there were like 150 people signed up originally. I'm not sure how many people actually joined, but thanks for keeping the conversation moving, Wojtek.
Thank you so much, man. All right, listen. So see you soon, I hope, and have a good day.
All right. Bye, everybody.